Open it up. Do you guys have questions? Start.
Okay, I have a question. So when you for you, so you were showing those graphs of the gecko, or it was a gecko, and they were talking about their endurance and like their oxygen levels. Like when I think about that, I think about like an athlete like on a treadmill.
Like in a Nike commercial, right? With the mask, yeah.
How the hell do you do that to a gecko?
So you put it in a chamber, right? And that chamber has a little treadmill in it.
Are you serious?
Yeah, it does. And I say that because I'm actually building these treadmills in my lab right now.
What do you like? What do you use to make a treadmill?
That's a great question. So there's so we use there's a lot of different types of plastics, and because the lizards that I study, much like geckos, have toe pads, which are a problem when things are running, and then all of a sudden they can just cling to a vertical surface and then peace out. And you don't want that, because you don't want to have to explain to the janitor why he might not want to go into the room to clean because something might jump out of the ceiling at him. So we have to use like these special plastics that actually don't allow for that clinging. So those toe pads require they're van der Waals bonds, right? So they're basically electron bonds between the toe pad and the surface that allow those animals to cling to vertical surfaces.
That's so cool.
It's a superpower, man.
That's so rad. It's not just like you're not just poking your fingers in holes. You're touching electrons.
Not poking our fingers in holes. Yeah.
I will say this seems like a very LA thing to make treadmills for lizards.
Yeah, that's true.
Geckos can be fat too.
Yeah,
they need to work out.
And
not in my lab.
You have to cancel plans with a friend because you're like, oh, dude, I got to build a treadmill for
all the time. All the time.
Vince, do you have any questions?
What I did think was very funny is that you mentioned that reptiles are usually a good base in in comics about basically I like that whenever there's like a reptile in comic books, they become like a villain. I just think it's like the ugliest thing is like a villain in comic books. How do you usually navigate what animal is a good reference point for an experiment?
Yeah, so there are two ways to approach organismal biology, like evolutionary biology. One is to find a system, right, a species or a group of species that you're really into, and then find a set of questions that's best for studying that species. Basically, find an excuse to just work with that species. And that is a very viable way of becoming an evolutionary biologist, like me. The other way is to identify a set of questions that you are really interested in, and then identify a species that's best suited for those questions. So, like back in the 1930s, there was this guy called August Crow, and he was a physiologist, and he said that for any problem that humans have, especially medical problems, right? There exists some species or some set of species for which that problem is most readily studied because of the evolutionary adaptations that those species have come up with, or because of the ease of experimentation with those species that we just can't do with ourselves, for good reason. And that sort of highlight that second component, right? So finding a question that you're interested in, or a question that you think is important, and then finding a species that's a good representation of trying to understand that. So a really weird example of this is something that I'm doing right now. It's like I'm studying tuskless elephants in Africa, like the evolution of tusk loss in elephants in response to poaching. I recently wrote a grant proposing the evolution of tuskless elephants as a model for understanding human hypodontia, right? The genetic loss of teeth in humans, right? Because they've gone through the same process. It's very likely that it has the same genetic mechanisms, but they don't have the consequences that humans seem to have. So this very odd system may actually be a very valuable model for understanding a very common genetic abnormality in humans.
Wow, thank you for answering my question. Very great, very thorough.
And that's how everyone here should answer. We answer your question.
Yeah.
You gotta say that.
Exactly.
So you're saying like elephants are losing their tusks. I was just wondering like how quickly can adaptations happen?
Very quickly. So the traditional view of evolution is that it happens very slowly. This is actually one of the things that Darwin got wrong, right? So I love Chuck a lot, right? Like he's the OG. Give him his props. But he was, in a lot of ways, he was like the victim of British mores at the time. He thought that evolution occurred very, very slowly, and that we could never actually observe it in real time. That we could only sort of see what it left behind, like footprints in the sand, so to speak. But what we're realizing now, like, especially my work, is all about contemporary adaptation, how humans act as selection pressures for species. One of the things that we're realizing is that not only does it happen in real time, but we can actually measure it in real time as well. And the quickest example that comes to mind is like within the course of a single calendar year, right, looking at the signature of selection play out within a population.
Do you have any examples of where it's gone the other way, of humans evolving quickly? Like, how are we adapting to the weird stuff we're doing to our own environment?
Oh yeah. Okay. So this is another one for the ladies. So when we consider technology, right? And we're considering childbirth specifically. And I the only reason why I bring this up is because I think it's one of the coolest examples of human evolution, or potential human evolution. So within the population, right, there are always a subset of women who have hips that are too narrow to give birth to a child, right? And that's because it's always healthy for a child to be large, right? And guys, we don't have that same constraint, so we're constantly cycling big-ass baby genes like back into the population, right? So there's always, some small subset of the population that cannot naturally give birth. But with the advent of C-section technology, right, so this is typically what we call cliff edge selection, right? It's great to have a baby till the baby can't pass through the birth canal, and then it's really, really crappy, right? And that's the cliff's edge. But with the advent of C-section technology, right, that cliff's edge has actually been released. And now women who typically could not safely give birth can, because of technological advancements. But then what that means consequently is that there's a larger proportion of the female population that has to give birth that way because that technology exists.
So we're just making bigger and bigger babies.
Big ass babies, yes.
So we're just gonna end up with like huge babies, right?
Real big babies.
But hasn't it always sort of been?
Yeah.
We got.
Yeah.
We should
I feel
keep
sorry for my
repeating the
partner.
same point.
Yeah.
So the baby's
Good luck
big.
having my big dinosaur ass babies.
But then they're normal size adults.
I mean, in some cases.
What's a normal sized adult? Yeah. I mean, I'd like to consider myself a normal sized adult, and I'm very small. Hasn't that always been the case though with people? Like, we've always had really deleterious babies, right? Like, as long as we've been humans, babies have sucked.
Yeah. So the thing, like, if you put a human baby next to pretty much any other baby and you say have a race, like we lose it every time, right?
Unless it's a turtle baby.
Even turtle babies. I mean, the thing, at least a turtle baby can move on its own, right? It can coordinate. It can coordinate.
Choke up on that boy.
This
Yes,
way?
that
okay,
way.
This
Okay.
way. So I like perform like music, like hip hop. Like this is like the cool way to hold the microphone. All right, this way. So the thing is, like, we care for our young much longer than most species do, and that's actually like really good for us, right? Because that means that we get to save all that energy for growing, right? Because we don't have to do other stuff. But that also means that we're basically useless for a vast swath
30
of our early
years,
lives.
just about.
Yeah, until about 34.
So I want to open up the questions to the audience if anybody has.
Yes, raise your hands.
We got one right there. Shout it and I'll repeat it.
How come there aren't? I can't even say it. How come there isn't just one gender?
How come there isn't just one gender is the gentleman's question.
Yeah, how come there isn't just one gender? That's a good question. And I think it has to do with this idea of recombination, right? So, across most species, like most, I'll say across vertebrates, which I could probably say confidently, being female is the default, right? And there's something else that has to happen during development for us to become male. And again, the reason why we have two genders, and there are some species that have more. There are some birds, for instance, that have 4 genders. But the reason why there are multiple genders is because of this idea of recombination, right? So if the benefit of being asexual is that you get to pass on 100% of your genome to the next generation, right? As opposed to us, like we pass on 50%, and then grandchildren, that becomes 25%, 12.5%, right? It keeps having, when every single generation. And an asexual species is 100% all the way down. But you also get this accumulation of deleterious mutations until the point where what's called mutational load, where you have so many deleterious mutations that the basic functions of the body, like development and performance, like start to break down. So sex allows us to to manage and purge those deleterious mutations in at least some subset of the chromosomes that are segregating.
We've got a question in the back, then we'll go to you. What's your question?
Okay, so bear with me while I get my thoughts together. So going back to the elephants, you were talking about human deterioration of teeth and how we can function, and eventually, like, you're starting to see that with the elephants and their tusks are maybe kind of retreating. So do you think we could either, and with poaching, aid the tusk retreatment so that they don't get poached as much, but do you think that would also be a huge hindrance to them with husking trees and getting the bark and everything they need? Is it like what's the level of like what we need to do versus what they need?
Let me repeat the question just for audio. So the question was, with elephants losing their tusks, can we somehow genetically speed that up to keep them from getting poached, since the tusks are the reason they're getting poached? But is there, what'd you call it, a cliff's edge? Is there a cliff's edge where losing their tusks becomes deleterious?
Yeah, so first of all, you obviously read the grant that I'm writing, and I would appreciate it if you stayed off my computer. So one, we're trying to understand exactly what it means to be tuskless. So tusks do serve a very important purpose for elephants. So in African elephants specifically, most individuals in normal circumstances are tusked, both males and females. But there's typically a very small proportion, between like 2 and 8% of the female population specifically, that are born naturally tuskless. But it's typically a very small proportion. But we know tusks play a role in like self-defense. It plays a role in digging. In order to dig up valuable minerals, to dig up water, and also to strip bark off of trees. So if you don't have those tusks, does that mean that you actually have to move through your environment differently? Does it mean that you're affecting your environment differently? Does it mean that you have to eat like different things? That's one of the things that we're trying to figure out. But that first question, like, can we speed that process up? The answer is yes, right? And that's through what we've, the reason why a dog looks like a dog is because we did some stuff very intentionally to it. It's like that Chihuahua that you have at home probably wishes it was still a wolf, but we had different plans for it. We can, obviously it's harder with elephants because they stay pregnant for like 2 years, right? So it's a much slower process. But through selective breeding, it is possible to potentially, speed up that process of tusklessness. And there are now places like Addo Elephant National Park in South Africa, where I was this summer, where 98% of the females are tuskless.
Wow. All right, let's get one more question from the audience. Yes, what's your question? We all wanted to know that.
No,
Thank you for asking.
Like, wait, what do you mean?
What is up with these four gendered birds?
Why don't we have? I mean, we may have more than 4 genders, right? I mean, it sort of depends on who you ask. Tell me more about the 4 gendered birds. So basically, this particular species has essentially more than 2 chromosomes that determine sex, right? So they can exist in different combinations within individuals, which means that, while we have, XX individuals and XY individuals, they can have, there's like ZW individuals, ZZ individuals, and then I forget what the 2 other like chromosomal designations are, but you can have like any combination therein.
Hell yeah. All right. I wanted to try to really quickly before the end steer back to superheroes.
Okay.
Okay, Russ wanted me to ask a specific question, but I actually had one. So I love Shane's podcast. Shane hasn't talked about his podcast yet. Shane and a gentleman who's in the audience run a podcast called The Biology of Superheroes. It's great. They talk about exactly what he did on stage today. You had one episode I really loved where you talk about animal weapons through the guise of superheroes. I have a bone to pick with you. Why didn't you fucking talk about Wolverine?
Why didn't I talk about Wolverine? Yeah, so fair bone to pick. The reason why I did not talk about Wolverine is because I think Wolverine is more interesting to talk about in the guise of aging and biological regeneration, which is an episode that we're planning in the future.
Fair.
So get off my back.
Okay,
Also,
I'm sorry.
wait, hold up. I don't know comics very well, but Wolverine, the claws were implanted. I thought the bone claw thing. Who knows anything about Wolverine? Clap it up if you know anything about Wolverine. All right, I'm not alienating too many people here. The
about to
bone
start
claw
nerd
thing.
fights.
I thought that was they retcon. They added that in, like, oh, we had these bone claws, then we put metal on them. I thought.
True or false,
Adamantium.
audience?
Mostly false. All right.
All right.
Cool. Well, I'm dumb as fuck, so whatever.
Russell, do you have one last question for anyone, and then?
No.
All right. All right, guys. So let's give a round of applause for Shane really quick. Shane for Vince. So, all right, there's something I like to do at the end, but before we do that, this is our last show at 2-Bit Circus. I know we love 2-Bit Circus here. We're going for our next show to a venue we were at before called Dynasty Typewriter. Dynasty Typewriter is great. We already have our scientist. So this is our scientist. He's here in the back. Woo! Give a round of applause for Spiros Michalakis. He's a quantum physicist from Caltech, and he was the science advisor for Ant-Man. And our comedian is a mystery.
Whoa.
We don't know yet. We'll find out. So get your tickets now if you want to grab a picture of this. Tickets do go fast at Dynasty, and if you get them before, you can get them for a better price. So try to grab this now and get your tickets first. Now, let's give a round of applause for Shane, everybody.
You give him like no time to take a picture.
Sorry.
Like no one got a picture of that.
All right, Dylan, get off my case. We'll do it later. But I also, if there's anybody in the audience who is in a STEM field, a scientist, an engineer, a mathematician, could you guys stand up, please, or at least raise your hand? Raise them. There you go. So we do this show not just for our amazing guests who are on stage, but also for all of you. Everybody here who works in STEM, loves STEM. You guys do amazing work. And anyone here who doesn't, look who raised their hand and have a conversation after the show. Thank you guys so much for coming out, supporting live comedy, live science. You're the reason we do the show, and we love you. Stick around and have drinks and play games.